Sometimes I think about slavery in America and it just stops me. Like, I actually have to pause and breathe because my mind doesn't want to accept that this was real, that there were breeding farms, that human beings were forced to have children the same way you'd force animals to reproduce, just so somebody else could profit off their bodies, their lives, and their pain. And I try to understand how everyone could have looked at another human being and decided you're less than me. You exist to be used. Like, I try to understand and I can't. I don't think it's something you're supposed to understand. It's so sad, honestly. So, guys, watch this video until the end to get the real story.
Let's cut the shit. Slavery in America wasn't just about forced labor. It was about forced birth. America didn't just work enslaved people to death. It bred them. And not like people, like livestock. If the transatlantic slave trade was a kidnapping, breeding plantations were the farm. And I said what I said. After the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808, the U.S. had a problem. They still wanted the free labor, but they had no more legal supply. Their solution? Turn black wombs into factories. Breeding plantations, and yes, they were called that, were designed specifically to reproduce more enslaved people. The goal wasn't to grow food, it wasn't to pick cotton. It was to force women to give birth to more product. Because that's what we were. Product. Black women weren't seen as mothers. They were uteruses with a resale value. Their fertility? That was the commodity. And their babies? Assets on a ledger. Let's be real. This was organized. Some enslavers forced women to have 10, 12, 15 children. Not out of love, but out of cold-blooded capitalism. Some kept track of their pregnancies like breeding dogs. Black girls, as young as 13, were to kickstart their production. If they couldn't reproduce, they were often whipped, sold, or killed. And don't you dare forget about the men. Black men were used as studs. That's literally the word they used. They were, too, forced to mate with women chosen by their enslaver, sometimes their own family, sometimes multiple women in a row. Consent was a fantasy, trauma was the norm, and the goal was always profit. Virginia, Maryland, and parts of North Carolina became baby farms for the Deep South. And once those babies hit a certain age, they were sold down the river, often with chains still attached to their mother's arms. This is the legacy that birthed America's wealth. Families like the Talos, the Ball family, and others made millions off of children born from these violent systems. Wall Street was built to insure and trade these bodies. And if you're wondering why Black women still aren't believed about our pain, why we're 3 times more likely to die in childbirth, this is the root. Doctors experimented on those same women without anesthesia. Gynecology was literally founded on the abuse of Black wombs. So no, slavery wasn't just labor. It was a full-blown human breeding industry. And if that makes you uncomfortable, it should, because America wasn't built by accident. It was built with intentional, systemic, with generational torture passed off as policy. And the fact that you can visit some of these plantations today and see wedding venues instead of crime scenes, that tells you everything about what this country values. Not justice, not truth, just comfort for white folks. But we're not going to be quiet about it. We're not going to soften the language anymore. And we're not going to let the history die just because they're ashamed of it. This happened, and now they're going to hear about it every damn time we speak.
So you mean to tell me, from the early 1600s to the late 1700s, you imported 400,000 niggas from Africa into America. And then from that 400,000 slaves imported, that number jumped to 40 million plus in only a couple decades here in America? And then the only reasoning that you have of this is because of breeding farms? Nah, I'm calling cap. All right, y'all. Y'all stay with me. We're about to break this down. Number one, the problem with the breeding farms is you can't force people to breed. What did you do? Did you sit in the room with your whip and told me to do my job and you thought that was gonna make me get hard? I mean, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm not into that kind of foreplay like that. And even still, the infant mortality rate was still high. A lot of slaves were malnourished, overworked, and they didn't receive the proper medical care or assistance during labor. So what kind of successful breeding program are you running if you're producing a lot of stillborns? And 3, out of all the Americas, that's South America, Central America, and the Caribbeans, North America is the only place that received the least amount of slaves but had the most amount of growth in the black population. How's that? 1789, they abolished slave importing, supposedly. So there was no going back and forth to Africa. And in 1789, the population of blacks was 700,000. And all the way up to 1860, that number jumped to 4 million. And from 4 million, that number jumped to 40 million plus in only a couple decades. Now, I'm not claiming to be no mathematician, but that don't sound like no ordinary breeding program. That sounds like you found you some niggas who was already in America. And if that's the case, who the fuck came from Africa? Y'all boys stay up top, man.
That I'm writing an album called The Middle Passage. They've shown us every plantation with cotton on it. You know what plantation they've never shown us, Abby? The most prominent ones. The ones that were most profitable. The breeding plantations. Why don't you want to show us those? You know why? Because after the research that I did for this album, you realize that the moment that a girl menstruated, she was put in a stable where a horse would be and forcibly mated, forcibly raped by a male of the slave master's choice. And when she had children, they weren't called children, they were called a litter of pups. The punishment for raping or killing a person in medieval Spain is gelding. Gelding is when you take hot pincers and you take a man's balls and dick off root and stem. Killing a person, law of the Bible, right? Medieval Spain, super religious. You killed a man, he should be killed. Why were indigenous and black people categorized as subhuman? So under the law, you would not be punished for the things that you did to us. That's why. You used to be proud, right? Used to be proud, white America, of rape and murder. Used to be proud of colonization. Used to, wow, that made us tough. And then you got ashamed of it. And that's what you're dealing with. That's what America's dealing with, a schizophrenic crisis. There's a British manual, right, that was taken out of the British Museum because within the manual, it talked about how rape was a weapon of war that should be used against the indigenous population. You're ashamed of that now. You're ashamed, right? Who was Christopher Columbus? His image has been so whitewashed, but he was trafficking little girls on an island. Who does that sound like, huh? All you right-wing defenders of Christopher Columbus and his legacy, he was trafficking 9-year-old indigenous girls on an island. Who does that remind you of, you intellectual coward? Just because liberals are dog shit doesn't mean that you shake hands with the devil.
Something that kills me is that a lot of people seem to think slavery was just agriculture. Y'all realize slaves were everywhere, right? I mean everywhere. And that one of the most profitable forms of slavery were breeding plantations. 1806, when receiving slaves, taking slaves off the shores of Africa was made illegal, we had probably about 1 million slaves here in the United States. Within like 4 decades, there was 4 million. Now we know typically the ratio is 50-50, right? Men and women. So really, let's say that's 500,000 female slaves, and it turned into 4 million. Breeding plantations. By the time a woman was seen as mature, by woman I actually mean child, this is when they start to menstruate. At that point, they were ready to be produced. Now, when a woman gave birth to her pups, because we were seen as animals and they were called pups, typically after nursing, they'd be, sent off. You had some plantation owners who would say, hey, if you give me 5 children, on that 6th child, I'll let you keep them and I'll free you. Now, I want you to keep something in mind. African Americans were valued more than all commodities in the North and South combined. So what that is, let's put it into more money terms, right? You give me $5 million, I'll set you free with a child. $5 million, I'll set you free with a child. That's really what that is. And there's not an actual price that was put on, person by person, but that's really what it is. like that's what it is. They knew that we were an extremely high value item person. So something that's also interesting too is that the term motherfucker, where does that come from? Breeding plantations. Not only would slave owners forcibly impregnate slave women, they would also force other slaves. And in order to make sure that nobody knew, because if you saw that you were sleeping with your brother or sister, you're probably not going to be able to get an erection, they would put bags over the heads of both parties. And that's how the term motherfucker came to be. Now, something else to add on to this, because we're going to bring Christianity into the mix. Thou shalt not kill, right? But that's kill other humans. And because we were not seen as humans, it was perfectly fine to kill us. So just think about it. If you're an African American, we came from such a small group, about 350,000 people. And now look at how many there are of us. Which in my eyes is like, hey, that's a reason that we need to stop being so divisive within our own community. Because we came from such a small gathering, such a small community. We need to get back together. Some other cool, interesting facts, if you're still here in the video, is that you know how society, especially within our own communities, we hypersexualize like light skins? That is also from slavery. In fact, if one were more fair skinned, they would be used as a fancy. A fancy as a prostitute. Black women in general during the antebellum, just slave times, were seen as more inherently lustful as well. And it was almost every slave owner's dream to sleep with one of us. And you remember those large dresses that had the big bums and big, like breasts? Those were modeled after black women because white men did not want to sleep with white women. They were seen as more modest and just not as appealing. With that being said, I'm going to close on the fact that, did you know that the average African American genome is about 15 to 25% European blood? Happy Black History Month.
All right, what's up, y'all? It's Ghetto Spiritual, and we are back with our first lesson. I hope y'all got y'all notebooks because we about to get into it, okay? Okay, today we're about to talk about breeding farms. So just want to give y'all a little back story. Breeding did take place prior to the breeding farm industry beginning. For those of y'all that don't know, breeding typically takes place in the animal industry, for instance, like in the dog industry, where you have one dog and another dog and you make them reproduce to create an offspring. However, that did not stop with dogs. That definitely traveled into our history as well. So like I said, breeding did take place on the plantations prior to the actual industry beginning. However, it didn't really turn into a common practice industry until about 1808. So in the year 1808, Congress basically made an economical decision and they decided to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, meaning that they stopped the trade of slaves from Africa to the Americas. I don't want y'all to get confused thinking that they were trying to do that to liberate us or to free us because they cared. No, that was literally just an economical decision. They decided that it would be more profitable for them to work within the Americas and keep the slaves trading domestically as opposed to importing them internationally. So basically, they wanted to cut the middleman out and become a self-sustaining America with their own slaves in rotation. So the two largest farms was in Maryland, D.C. They call it Maryland Eastern D.C., and the largest one was in Richmond, Virginia. Virginia alone sold 10 to 20,000 slaves every single month. So the breeding farms consisted of mainly women and young children. There were men there, but the ratio was 2 women to every 1 male. They forced young black girls to reproduce as early as age 13, and she was expected to have at least 4 to 5 children by the age 20. Some breeding farms promised young women freedom if and when they bore 15 children. By the age of 15, young boys were expected to have children. They were expected to have at least 12 babies per year, and they were required to work for at least 5 years. So at the age of 15, sometimes earlier, the young boys will be inspected by the owner of the breeding farms, and they will basically check their private areas to see if they were developed or not. If they were underdeveloped, they would have their testicles castrated and sent over to a market. If they were, or they would send them just to go work on the farm. And if they were developed, then they would be expected to reproduce. Follow me to the next part. So just to continue where we left off, the young boys did have their testicles castrated and sent over to a market if they were underdeveloped, or they sent them over to the farms to work. If they were developed, then they were expected to start reproducing with the women that they had on the farm. They didn't care about bloodlines, ancestry, or DNA or anything like that. They only cared about making a profit. So if the boy was buck, as they call it, strong, tall, hardworking, they would have them reproduce with the women to make more of those strong young children. So the enslaved men decided that they wanted to put hoods over their head while they were being forced to sleep with the women, because a lot of times it would have been their sisters, their aunts, or even their moms. So in order to not add on an additional layer of trauma of being forced to sleep with even your mother, they would put these hoods over their head in order to keep that part a secret. The white breeders were very invested in women's fertility, black women's fertility, and black enslaved women's reproductive health. Black enslaved women were actually some of the first people in this country to receive free health care. There is documentation of a young 13-year-old girl who was forced to have as many babies as possible. In the slave narratives, there's also documentation of a man named Bert who was forced to have at least 200 children in his lifetime. No one talks about this, but this was a very, very powerful, very lucrative industry within the slave industry. So just to draw the picture, there was a farm where white breeders would force young black girls and young black boys to reproduce with one another for the sole purpose of selling them off. So these young women would have these babies and have them snatched away from her to be sold. The babies will get sold and go anywhere across the South and be forced to work for the rest of their lives. Follow me to part 3. Okay, so this is part 3 of the breeding farm video. If you haven't seen the other 2 parts, please go watch that first. Just a quick wrap up for those of you who aren't going to go watch the other video. Basically, in the year 1808, Congress decided that it would be more profitable to cut the middlemen out and to stop importing slaves from Africa. They only wanted to deal with the slaves domestically and to only utilize our own, well, not our, but only utilize their own slave trade that they had within the states. The largest breeding farm was in Richmond, Virginia, and that one breeding farm alone shipped out and sold 10 to 20,000 black bodies every single year, or actually every single month, which is even worse. Every single month, they had at least 10 to 20,000 black babies sold on a consistent basis. The young black girls are expected to have babies as early as 13. The young black boys are expected to have babies as early as 15. They oftentimes had to reproduce with family members, and they will put hoods over their head in order to alleviate, I guess, one layer of the trauma that they were being subjected to. It's traumatizing enough being forced to have relations with someone, but it's also even more traumatizing to be forced to reproduce with your mother or your sister or your aunt. Once the babies were of age, they were sold and shipped off to another plantation to never see their mother or father again. A lot of the times, the white breeders also forced themselves upon the young black girls, and he forced them to sleep with him as well. Sometimes he did impregnate them, and when he did, the wife of the breeder, the white wife, became very jealous, and she subjected the young girl to a lot of torture and a lot of abuse, and she also subjected the child to the same. A lot of times, the white women would behead the black baby that was created with their white husband. So not only did the young black girls have to deal with being forced to sleep with someone, forced to have a baby, they also had to deal with their baby being snatched away or sometimes even beheaded right in front of them. There were breeding farms all across the South. I don't want you to think that it was just in those 2 places that I mentioned. There were breeding farms a lot of places because breeding was actually a very common practice that is just not discussed. So I know that's a lot of information to unpack, so I'm going to be giving us a few more days to really digest and do our own independent research about what I just discussed, because I want to make sure that the entire collective is on the same page before we move on to our next subject. There's a lot of articles online for those of you who are going to do your own research. Just Google breeding farm slavery. You have to make sure you include slavery, or otherwise it's just going to talk about breeding across animals. So yeah, breeding farm slavery, type it in. You should get a lot of information. If you don't really see anything, I use an app called DuckDuckGo. I learned that on TikTok. So if you download that app and search it in, you'll find what I found.
Because it wasn't ignorance, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice made by white slave holders to treat black people like property instead of people. Breeding farms weren't some side details of slavery. They were a system, a business model. Enslaved women were raped over and over, not for love, not even for desire, but for profit. Enslaved men were paid like livestock. Children were born into chains before they could even take their first breath. Oh my God, like this is such a sad thing to talk about, because families were ripped apart without a second thought. Babies sold away from their mothers, and all this was legal, normalized, and defended. That's the part that messes with me the most. Not just that it happened, but that it was justified. There were laws, sermon, textbooks, and so-called science all built to support this evil. People went to church on Sunday, prayed to God, and then went home and enslaved another human being on Monday. And they slept fine at night. So when people say that was a long time ago, or why can't we just move on? I wonder, move on from what exactly? From a system where unimaginable violence was foundational? Because America wasn't just accidentally involved in slavery. America was built on it. Its economy, its land, its power, all soaked in the blood of suffering of the black people who never given a choice. And the truth is, the legacy didn't disappear when slavery ended. You don't erase generation of brutality and dehumanization with a piece of paper. The trauma carries forward, the inequality carries forward, and the refusal to fully acknowledge what happened carries forward. What's really hard to understand is how people still resist calling it what it was: evil. Not complicated, not a product of its time, evil. And that's it. It was evil, and those were evil people. There is nothing neutral about forcing humans to reproduce for profit. There is nothing debatable about stealing someone's body, their children, and their future. I think part of why people struggle to face this history is because it shatters the idea of America as purely noble and righteous. It forces us to admit that greatness was built alongside cruelty, that freedom for some depended on the complete unfreedom of others. But avoiding the truth doesn't make it go away. It just keeps the wound open. If you really want to understand this country, if we really want justice, we have to sit with how horrifying this was. We have to say their suffering mattered, their lives mattered, and we have to stop pretending that something so deeply evil didn't leave a permanent mark on everything that came after, because it did, and we are still living with it. Black Americans are still suffering till this day, and it hasn't changed. I wouldn't compare it to those times, because I swear, like, the black people have really suffered and fought for this country and the freedoms of other immigrants to exist, and that is why I always look up to them with so much respect. Because if it were not for them or for their ancestors, many of us could not have those opportunities to come here and study, or to work, or just to live and exist with the whites in America. And it's so sad. And yeah, I just hope the world can change and be better, but I just know that's a big dream, like it's a dream. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you leave a like and a comment about what you think, and don't forget to subscribe, and hope to see you in the next video.